This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you. I must confess that I'll be one of the very few people who at this conference will not have a PowerPoint presentation. I will not use visual aids for the very simple reason that I've been unable, in spite of my best efforts, to track down an image of the image that pretty much provides a starting point of my study here. And since I could not, unfortunately, secure what would be the most plausible, if not the image or images in question, I said, well, might as well try to make my voice less soporific and keep things interesting by reading alone, mainly because since the images in question were impossible to find, I had to rely on textual evidence myself. So without further ado, in 1901, Romania's foremost playwright, Ionuca Caragiale, jotted down a list of sounds, objects, moods, and words which sought to evoke Bucharest's largest suburban fair. As is the case with the work of any author in a nation's literary canon, no stone is left unturned. No text, its actual or indeed deliberate incomprehensibility notwithstanding, is beyond reappropriation by posterity. Moshi, tabla de materii, so this would be Moshi, which is the name of the fair in question, table of contents, makes no exception. Though a checklist of long-lost references, it is not uncommon nowadays to find it served matter-of-factly to unsuspecting schoolchildren. That Caragiale delighted in the very ephemerality of many an item on his checklist seems usually not to trigger any archaeological impulses in either teacher or pupil, sadly. Naturally, some references are more lost on us than others. Among mentions of, and here are things on his list, pickpockets, I quote, the latest inventions as shown at the American exhibition, and here's a phrase that did make history in and of itself, my dear boy, what a terrible crisis. But a few stand out, not merely by virtue of local color or oddity. Among them, perhaps, the most striking of all is the portrait of the Czar. Why would, in the capital of an independent and intensely nationalist country, such an item be available for sale? Why would there be a demand amongst the mostly rural fairgoers for such a thing? And what might we glean from Caragiale's mention? Consternation, detachment, irony towards those who cared for such things? The venerable author provides us with but one late example from a long line of equally enigmatic invocations. To put things into perspective, Romania had been independent from the Ottoman Empire since 1878, and the Russian troops which had led the warfare against the former sovereign power had vacated Romanian territory soon after. Stationed in villages, they left behind as gifts portraits of the Tsar and of famous Russian generals. Well, this is the narrative put forth by Iranian sources anyway. Furthermore, Russian salesmen traveled with their wares across the country, selling mass-produced religious paintings, icons in the Christian Orthodox tradition, also carrying, it seems, the aforementioned engraved portraits. That icons have traditionally been the only images adorning peasant households is a fact often stressed by concerned pamphleteers. What then of the more novel ones? As one would kiss an icon in church, would one grow affectionately pious towards the Tsar. Hence, ambiguity with regard to peasant attitudes towards something which may have had potent symbolic value, or merely fulfilled a spendthrift desire for aesthetic embellishment in the novel context of capitalist consumption. The present paper shall focus thus on casting light on what seemed to be lost in the democratic uniformity of Caragiale's table of contents. I will here argue on the basis of archival research that surrounding the portrait of the Tsar there developed in late 19th century Romania a cultural phenomenon marked by a double ambiguity. On the one hand, from the standpoint of the bourgeois establishment, uncertainty with regard to peasants' attitude towards the portrait of the Tsar was it reverence or confusion. On the one hand, the historian's uncertainty with regard to classifying said bourgeois reactions may we refer to them simply as anxiety, anger, dismay. It is to be stated plainly that despite significant efforts, no examples of such objects in the given historical context could be found. This in and of itself should be taken as a sign of the foreignness of the matter from the standpoint of contemporary perceptions on the cultural environment of late 19th century Romania, and no one has bothered picking up on the topic again, to my knowledge. Of the ultimately achieved goals of nationalist rhetoric, and of the material frailty of what in the end were only cheap paper engravings kept in damp peasant mud huts, by and large. That wooden icons of a similar age and provenance have survived and are now oftentimes family heirlooms, and I happen to be in possession of one myself at home, is conversely interesting in its own right. Sturdy, protected from being discarded or estranged by the religious role, their story is a markedly different one. We have no time to comparatively delve into theological musings on the materiality of icons and the theological role then and now. But what we must openly admit, however, is that our research must deal not so much with objects themselves, given the fate of the more relevant category, but with their textual traces. Let us first clear out the ground by tackling the political implications of the presence of these engravings. They are, in fact, fairly straightforward in the context of a 19th century nation-state, for that state is a jealous god. Competition is unacceptable. But there is, in our case, a subtext. The Tsar is not merely the ruler of a neighboring, perceivedly expansionist empire. Historically, he assumes the role of Orthodox Christianity's protector against the Turk, first and foremost. Allegiance along such lines is of a kind which predates and perhaps renders impossible nationalism, and is therefore highly problematic for a state which, 1, has only just declared itself independent, 2, has made efforts to set up an autonomous national church, and most importantly, 3, projects onto the peasant the fantasy of an instinctive, innate bond with the nation, the very embodiment of which he seems to be. By taking the latter point within the context of the endemic poverty and political exclusion of the peasant masses at the hands of the same political establishment, we come to understand the potential relevance of what is otherwise a mere footnote in the annals of Romanian nationalism's cultural history. Our engravings are one instance in which its contradictions could be exposed. Is the peasant, in fact, worse at what he ought to be best at, being the Romanian nation in its purest form? In the establishment's terms, would the peasant count as passive, stupid, or cunning for drawing attention to himself thusly? These are questions which arise even more poignantly in a related context, one which has equally been ignored, it seems, but for which we have no time here. Petitions sent by Romanian peasants to the Tsar. Rather surprisingly, I have yet to see both them and the engravings mentioned in the same breath in my sources. However, since there is no definite corpus to speak of, trawling through an inordinate number of, by and large, non-digitized periodicals is the only way of stumbling across mentions of either phenomenon. What we may be certain of is the recurrence of these two themes with added variations. Suffice it to say for now, thus, that the richer harvest is that of our present topic. Though the perishable, fragile nature of the objects in question has made finding surviving examples impossible, their very materiality allowed at the time for a proliferation of textual sources documenting a war position. By this I mean that there was ample debate concerning what is to be done, producing, selling, even distributing as school prizes legitimate engravings that would fill the same niche, literally the same niche, on the walls of the peasant. Furthermore, perceiving the problem as inseparable from that of the peasant's culturally ingrained need for devotional objects, the Romanian Orthodox Church, again as I mentioned, at the time very much an instrument of nation building at the hands of the Romanian state, freshly autonomous, stepped in, seeking to monopolize the market soon after the presence of the aforementioned Russian traveling salesman was outlawed after 1889. In what follows, I shall argue that the key to answering our questions is framing them in terms of discontinuities in certain gazes. And by this I mean two things. One, that according to the bourgeois imagination, there is an economy of the peasant's continuous, unbroken religious gaze. More plainly stated, the peasant is incapable of changing mind frame while shifting his eyes from the icon to the Tsar. Two, that when the portrait of the Tsar is evoked without the mediation of a peasant proxy, it is within an economy of a discontinuous biopolitical gaze interjected by a wholly different one, flagging the presence of something which is anomalous, not on grounds of hygiene, but of morality as divorced from its bodily sources. For instance, suspecting a hovel and lamenting its squalor is one thing, remarking upon the presence of a morally problematic engraving is another, though they both fall ultimately under the heading of sins against national growth. Let us begin with an article which is most representative of the phenomenon at large. And this is something that I did indeed cherry pick from a number of sources. Published in early 1887, it puts forth narrative of an impressionable peasant and his concerned bourgeois students, and I quote, "A people is cultivated through books and images, and though the latter only if it is illiterate. The vast majority of our population will passionately talk about hearsay and what it might have seen, and of the War of Independence will tell you with utmost sincerity, though with shocking lies and tall tales, unwilling to forget any of them. That is what the Russian images on his wall tell him. A peasant might have some vague notion of Romanians having fought a war against the Turks somewhere south of the Danube in Bulgaria, but will nod incredulously as if looking at the wall for some graven proof. From dusk till dawn he will cross himself, when sitting at the table or setting off on a journey, and in so doing he will set his eyes on an icon, Not understanding the Russian words written on it, but pleasantly reminded of the Russian painter's mastery, in his conscience and his imagination, further affection for the Russians is thus daily added. The article then continues at length, describing the cunning of the merchants who, even at a loss, would make sure to either give an engraving of the Tsar as a bonus for any other purchase or vice versa. This is not a tale, however, of walls being adorned for the sake of it, at least at face value, but of peasants being taught to consume Russian engravings, be they religious or not, with the same certainty that they are visual proxies for mythical truth. That the Romanian peasant is a peeping Tom in need of proof for his faith is not the issue. The issue is rather that of catering for his visual needs. As the emotion words employed, incredulously, passionately, suggest, his is a universe of childlike wonder, as the conclusion to the article in fact explicitly argues. This is a vision of agency in which the peasant is not to blame, but only because of his susceptibility. Romania Rurală, which is to say rural Romania, a newspaper published at the turn of the century by students of rural origin, paints a different picture altogether. In open letter, slaves to the foreigners, fathers of the villagers, those endowed with moral authority in the eyes of the peasant mass, priests, teachers, well-off farmers, are the most blameworthy of all. Here I quote, "I think, full of grief but not bereft of hope, of our peasants, be they rich or poor, who much the misfortune of our nation are not only the economic slaves of foreigners, but also morally so. The peasant will enter your home." So he's talking to the aforementioned categories. "A peasant will enter your home and look at your walls. Tell me, what will he see? An icon of the Virgin and the portrait of the Tsar and all of his relatives next to it. He will then ask you, 'Fathers of the village, who are they?' And you will answer, some of you not without pride. The peasant will be amazed at your answers and unknowingly will learn to prostrate himself before the foreigners and despise himself, thinking that our nation has no heroes. For if it had any, their image would surely hang from the walls of the teacher, of the vicar, or of his betters. Throw away these disgusting things that the Russian icon merchants have brought to your home, for you may easily find the portraits of all our nation's heroes with ease at any fair." Note the prosternates in the original Romanian is the same word as that for crossing oneself. This is an account in which the gaze is again problematized, the gaze of the peasant, that is, and the impossibility of severing the religious connection. We have further note that the author, tightropping between a peasant and a bourgeois with a rhetorical and social identity, again, he is one of the very few who, as a peasant boy, becomes a university student, foregrounds his own emotions as much as those of the peasant and of the chided village fathers. And finally, the article is quite right. Towards the end of the century, those who invest in peasants' newspapers often also invest in patriotic engravings. The problem is now that of the culpability of those who have a choice and yet still deliberately forego the morally correct option, that of having national engravings of heroes on their walls. But the seriousness of the state of affairs, broadly speaking, could be called into question, insofar as its institutionalization reeked of diversion in the eyes of peripheral political actors. Thus, in 1889, for instance, earlier on, the maverick Glasul Țăranului, the peasant's voice, closes off altogether any emotional avenues of interpretation. I quote, "The newspapers of the recently deposed government see nothing but Russian icon merchants ever since they've been chased away from the honeypot." This would come from a press outlet purporting to represent peasant interests is not significant. Is not insignificant. The very grounds of establishment discourse could be dismissed as unsubstantiated. Thus, we may interpret this as an assertive move seeking to prevent the reproduction of a discourse which unilaterally projects upon the peasant a specific emotional profile. No merchants, no post-moral panic, no passive peasant subject. Now let us continue with our second scenario, that of the interrupted biopolitical gaze. That an entire genre of what I would dare call biopolitical rants proliferated at the time ought not be surprising. The nation, its mores, and its hygiene could and did spur the drafting of lengthy tracts. Thus, an overview of, and here I quote, the title is quite shocking. "The peasant's hygiene, his abode, its lighting and heating, his clothing, footwear, and diet at various times and in various regions of the country," unquote, won a significant prize from the Romanian Academy in 1895. As sprawling as its title suggests, it mentions early on, of a deliberately dispassionate manner, that, I quote, "the peasants' walls are bare, save for a few rags, religious icons, and portraits of the Tsar and generals received as gifts during the War of Independence," unquote. This flags the issue, but only insofar as it foreshadows the ethnographic taxonomies, descriptions of aesthetical norms for dress and household, in later chapters of the same book. However, the fact that this is brought up under the heading of hygiene, that this piece of information cannot wait for until later, is in and of itself telling. As mentioned earlier on, our theme is one which admits variation. Apărătorul Satanului, the villager's defender, another peasant, or rather, journal for peasants, publishes 1906, the letter of a priest from the southwesterly county of Dolj, under the title Din traista nevoilor Satanului, which is to say, from the grab bag of peasant woe. As the title suggests, the article busies itself with a rather graphical depiction of poverty, but the medical/bipolitical gaze reorients itself swiftly. Not rarely have I seen in village houses pictures of foreign faces, usually Austrian emperors and princes. And on the same note, socialist newspapers, so again, very much political outliers, in their indictment of bourgeois mistreatment of the working classes, for instance, mention in passing that Franz Joseph is to be seen on the walls of North Moldavian huts. In fact, it may be said that this almost becomes conventional, an expected jolt, if you will, when assessing poverty and misery from an otherwise more scientifically informed standpoint. Though telltale signs of auctorial emotion as a reaction to the portrait's presence is suppressed or absent, the question of whether or not this almost institutionalized practice sought to trigger a specific emotional reactions in the reader is open. At the very least, the biopolitical was ultimately subsumed to the moralizing tale of nationalism unfulfilled. And to conclude, it is of our own accord that we point this out. We are sadly none the wiser as to why Caragiale's fairgoers would, as late as 1901, be interested in such wares. The mechanisms of emotion and intention underlying peasant attitudes will forever be recoverable, doubly so due to the bourgeois discourse which we have just analyzed. Likewise, we do not know, in spite of Romanian journalists' constant reference to the coordinated efforts of Russian conspiracy, whether or not our engravings were in any sense officially produced, let alone for such a purpose. Furthermore, we do not know whether Romanian peasants cared much for which Tsar hung from their wall. 3 Tsars, in fact, had successively reigned during the period in question: Alexander II until 81, Alexander III until 1894, and Nicholas II, last Tsar, starting with 1894. In any case, it is a question which the bourgeois observers do not seem to ask either. There seems to be no further point in ironically noting that our illiterate peasants have no sense of anachronism. This further reinforces, therefore, our point with regard to the irrelevance of any such portrait's material characteristics, its very presence, and the problematic economy of emotional responses imagined to be triggered and triggered in those doing the imagining is what matters. Thank you.